Reuben had seen a lot of things in his 15 years as a station chef. He'd cooked for species that breathed methane, species that absorbed nutrients through their skin, and one memorable ambassador who insisted on eating while suspended upside down from the ceiling. None of that prepared him for what walked, no, stampeded, into his cafeteria on that particular afternoon. The IGSS constellation was the kind of place where impossibilities became routine. A diplomatic station the size of a small city, it orbited a neutral moon in a sector of space where three major galactic powers converged. Thousands of species passed through its corridors daily, each with their own dietary requirements, cultural taboos, and opinions about proper meal presentation. Reuben's cafeteria sat at the heart of it all, a sprawling space with adjustable gravity zones, atmospheric controls, and enough specialized cooking equipment to make a university chemistry lab jealous. On any given day, Reuben might prepare photosynthetic enhancement smoothies for the Peluvians, mineral-rich slurries for the Ruknari, and good old-fashioned protein plates for species that still enjoyed the concept of chewing. He'd learned to handle it all with a combination of skill, improvisation, and a running commentary of sarcastic observations that his staff had learned to ignore. Today started normally enough. The breakfast rush had been manageable, only 2 incidents of incompatible species sitting too close together, and nobody had actually fainted from atmospheric cross-contamination. Lunch service was ramping up nicely. Reuben stood in his kitchen, a gleaming domain of stainless steel and adaptive cooking surfaces, watching the dining area through the serving window while he plated a delicate arrangement of crystallized minerals for a Quellan diplomat. That's when Talion appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking like a man who'd just been told his retirement fund had been invested in asteroid mining stocks. The station administrator was usually unflappable. You didn't survive in intergalactic diplomacy without nerves of titanium. But right now, he had that specific expression people get when they're about to make something someone else's problem. "Reuben, we need to talk," Talion said, somehow making those 4 words sound like an apology, a warning, and a cry for help all at once. Reuben didn't look up from his plating. If this is about the Quellan ambassador complaining that her mineral arrangement wasn't geometrically perfect, tell her I'm a chef, not a mathematician. It's not about that. Talion stepped fully into the kitchen, lowering his voice even though the nearest staff member was 20 feet away and elbow-deep in a vat of protein gel. The Nalrathi delegation has arrived. Now Reuben looked up. The apex predators from that high-gravity death world? The ones with the peace negotiations? Those would be the ones, yes? And you're telling me this because— Talion's expression somehow got worse. They brought their younglings, 6 of them, for a cultural exchange program. Reuben set down the plating tongs with exaggerated care. Let me get this straight. Apex predators brought their children to a diplomatic station full of prey species. The younglings are part of the peace initiative, building bridges between species, fostering understanding, showing that even natural predators can coexist peacefully. Who approved this? The Galactic Council thought it would be a wonderful gesture of goodwill. The Galactic Council, Reuben said flatly, has clearly never met an actual child of any species. He turned back to his mineral arrangement, adding a final crystalline shard with more force than strictly necessary. What does this have to do with me? They'll be visiting various parts of the station, including, potentially, the cafeteria. No. Reuben, absolutely not. Do you know how many species in this station are on the Nalrathi's natural prey list? About 80% of them. You want me to serve lunch while baby apex predators wander around triggering every survival instinct in the building? They're very well behaved, according to their caretaker. Reuben gave him a look that could have curdled milk at 20 paces. Talion, my friend, my occasional drinking buddy, my favorite person to complain to about supply chain logistics. Have you ever met a well-behaved child? Of any species? Talion had the grace to look sheepish. The negotiations are delicate. If anything goes wrong, if the Nalrathi feel their younglings aren't welcome. Fine, fine. Reuben threw his hands up, nearly knocking over a container of purple garnish powder. When are these little bundles of teeth and claws gracing us with their presence? Talion checked his tablet. About 10 minutes ago, actually. They should be arriving. A crash from the dining area cut him off. Not the polite clatter of someone dropping silverware. This was the sound of furniture being violently rearranged by something that didn't understand, or care about, the concept of personal property. Reuben closed his eyes. You've got to be kidding me. The screaming started a moment later. Not pain screams, thankfully, more like the collective gasp of 100 beings suddenly realizing they were sharing space with their evolutionary nightmares. Reuben grabbed a clean towel, wiped his hands with the air of a man marching toward his own execution, and headed for the dining area. What he found there would have been hilarious if it wasn't happening in his cafeteria. 6 Nalrathi cubs had turned the lunch service into an obstacle course. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, covered in scales that shimmered between deep purple and black, with multiple rows of developing teeth visible whenever they opened their mouths. Which was often. They had the kind of claws that evolution designed for gripping struggling prey, and tails that whipped around with enough force to knock over chairs, and they were everywhere. One had climbed onto a table where a group of Peluvian delegates had been enjoying their photosynthetic lunch. The Peluvians, delicate, translucent beings who literally absorbed nutrients from light, had plastered themselves against the far wall, making high-pitched sounds of distress, while the cub investigated their abandoned meal trays with intense curiosity. Another cub had discovered the decorative plants Reuben kept near the entrance. Decorative being the operative word. They weren't meant for consumption. The cub didn't seem to care, enthusiastically taste-testing each species of foliage while shredding leaves with those impressive teeth. 2 more cubs were engaged in what appeared to be a game of tag, racing between tables at speeds that shouldn't be possible for creatures that young. Chairs scattered in their wake. A Quellan diplomat, the same one from earlier, ironically, lay in a dead faint on the floor, her geometric mineral lunch scattered around her in definitely non-perfect arrangements. The remaining 2 cubs had discovered the beverage station and were currently trying to figure out how the dispensers worked, pressing buttons at random and creating a growing puddle of mixed liquids on the floor. Standing in the middle of this chaos, looking like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, was an adult Nalrathi. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her scales a deeper shade of purple than the younglings, with ceremonial markings etched along her arms. She was making apologetic gestures to anyone who would look at her, which wasn't many people since most of the cafeteria's occupants were either fleeing or trying to become one with the walls. Reuben surveyed the scene with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. One of the cubs, the one who'd been testing the plants, noticed him and froze, leaves still hanging from its mouth. They locked eyes. The cubs were a startling amber color, bright with intelligence and mischief. "Well," Reuben said to nobody in particular, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced ease, "this is exactly as adorable as I thought it would be." The adult Nalrathi turned to him, relief flooding her features. She spoke in heavily accented but comprehensible common. "Please, forgive. The younglings are They have never seen— She gestured helplessly at the chaos. A cafeteria? Reuben supplied. Yeah, I gathered that. He raised his voice, projecting it across the dining area with the kind of authority that came from years of managing chaotic lunch rushes. All right, everyone who's not currently having a panic attack, let's start with some basic cleanup. Staff, get those knocked-over chairs back upright. Someone check on our fainted friend over there. And for the love of— someone turn off that beverage dispenser before we're knee-deep in fruit juice. His staff, trained to respond to his voice even during catastrophes, sprang into action. The adult Nalrathi looked at him with something like hope. You are not afraid? Oh, I'm terrified, Reuben said cheerfully. But fear doesn't clean up messes, and I've got about 60 more people due for lunch service in 20 minutes. He looked at the cubs, who had all stopped their various activities to stare at him. You must be Amrissa, the caretaker Talion mentioned. She nodded, her posture suggesting deep embarrassment. I am. These are my charges. I apologize. They are going through a difficult phase. Aren't we all? Reuben studied the cubs. The one who'd been eating the plants still had leaves in its mouth. Got names for these little terrors? Amrissa pointed to each cub in turn. Nix, Orna, Pip, Rala, Miko, and Tali. The plant-eater was apparently Nix. He, or she, Reuben, honestly couldn't tell with juvenile Nalrathi, had now completely abandoned the plants in favor of watching Reuben with unblinking attention. Right. Nix, Orna, Pip, Rala, Miko, and Tali. Reuben committed the names to memory with the same efficiency he used for remembering complex recipes. Amrissa, you and I need to have a conversation about meal arrangements. But first, he looked at the cubs. Does anyone want to explain to these younglings that decorative plants aren't food? Or should I just replace my entire entrance display weekly? One of his staff members, a young human named Ollie who usually handled the beverage stations, cleared his throat nervously. Should we, maybe get them out of the dining area before the lunch rush actually hits? And put them where exactly? Reuben asked. Back in their quarters, where they're clearly bored out of their minds? No, that's how we ended up here in the first place. He made a decision that he'd probably regret. Amrissa, bring them to my kitchen. At least there I can keep an eye on them while we figure out what to feed them. Amrissa looked shocked. You would permit younglings in your food preparation area? I've had worse things in my kitchen. Last month, my ambassador's emotional support creature got loose in there. This can't be worse than that. It absolutely could be worse than that, but Reuben had learned that projecting confidence was half the battle. Come on, little terrors. Let's see if we can find you something to eat that doesn't result in intergalactic incidents. Nix was the first to move, bounding toward Reuben with unsettling speed. The others followed, suddenly treating him like the most interesting thing in the station. Amrissa hurried after them, still apologizing profusely. Talion, who'd been watching from the kitchen doorway this entire time, gave Reuben a look that mixed gratitude with pity. Reuben ignored him, leading his small parade of chaos back into the kitchen while mentally calculating how many things could go catastrophically wrong in the next hour. The answer, he suspected, was all of them. Every single one. Getting 6 hyperactive predator cubs into the kitchen turned out to be the easy part. Keeping them from destroying everything was considerably harder. Nix immediately tried to climb into the walk-in freezer. Orna discovered the warming trays and pressed her face against the heated surface with a purr that sounded like a small engine. Pip and Miko started a wrestling match near the prep station, their tails knocking over a carefully organized rack of spice containers. Rala found the utensil drawers fascinating and began pulling out every single item to examine it. Tali, the smallest of the group, managed to climb onto a counter and sat there like a scaly gargoyle, watching everything with enormous amber eyes. Reuben's kitchen staff evacuated without being told. Smart people. So, Reuben said, surveying his newly infested domain with the resignation of a man who'd already accepted his fate. I'm guessing you didn't bring them here just to redecorate my kitchen. Amrisa wrung her hands, or the Nalrathi equivalent, her clawed fingers twisting together in obvious distress. They will not eat. Nothing we provide satisfies them. The standard Nalrathi provisions, the protein cubes, the nutrient slurry, they reject everything. How long has this been going on? 3 cycles, nearly 4 now. Amrisa's tail drooped. At home, they ate normally, but since arriving on the station, they refuse proper food. They are hungry, obviously hungry, but they will not eat what is given. Reuben caught Pip attempting to chew on a rubber floor mat and redirected the cub with practiced efficiency. You tried fresh meat? Of course. They sniffed it and walked away. Cooked meat? Amrisa looked confused. Why would we cook it? Nalarathi consume flesh raw. Cooking destroys nutrients and alters the... Yeah, I get it. Reuben watched Nix, who'd given up on the freezer and was now investigating a tray of cooling pastries meant for the afternoon service. The cub's nostrils flared, taking in the scent with obvious interest. But these aren't adult warriors on a hunt. They're kids in a completely new environment, surrounded by strange smells and unfamiliar everything. Maybe they don't want normal right now. I do not understand. Reuben pulled the pastry tray away before Nix could sample it. The little terror made a disappointed sound that was almost comical. When human kids get stressed or overwhelmed, they get picky. They want comfort food, familiar things, or sometimes just anything that isn't what their parents are offering, because being difficult is the only control they have. He looked at Amrisa. You said they ate fine at home? Yes, perfectly normal appetite. And now they're on a strange station with weird gravity and unfamiliar sounds and probably about 1,000 new smells their little predator brains are trying to process. Reuben crouched down, putting himself at eye level, with Nix. The cub tilted his head, studying this strange, soft-skinned creature with intense curiosity. They're not refusing food because they're not hungry. They're refusing it because they're overwhelmed, and being picky is how they're coping. Amrisa's spinal ridge, which had been flattened in distress, slowly raised. You believe this is behavioral? I believe this is being a kid, which is universal no matter how many teeth you've got. Reuben stood up, his knees protesting the movement. The question is what to do about it. You can't exactly explain emotional regulation to a youngling who mostly thinks in terms of food, play, and nap. Orna had left the warming trays and joined Nix in staring at Reuben. Then Rala abandoned the utensils. Within moments, all 6 cubs had formed a loose semicircle around him, their attention suddenly focused with unsettling intensity. That's not creepy at all, Reuben muttered. Amrisa, they're not about to eat me, right? No, they are curious. Nalrathi younglings fixate on novel stimuli. You are. She searched for words. Very novel. Great. I'm a novel stimulus. Reuben considered his options. The cubs were clearly hungry. He could see it in the way they moved, slightly less energetic than healthy younglings should be. Going 4 cycles without proper nutrition was dangerous for growing bodies, no matter the species. All right, let's try something. Amrisa, what do Nalarathi younglings eat in the wild before they're old enough to hunt? Their mother provides regurgitated, "Nope, we're not doing that. Next option." Amrisa's scales rippled in what might have been amusement. Partially processed meat, torn into small pieces, softened by digestive enzymes. So essentially pre-chewed, easy-to-consume protein. Reuben's mind started working through possibilities. And flavor-wise, do Nalrathi have preferences? We prefer iron-rich protein, the taste of fresh kill. Blood flavor, got it. Reuben moved to his cold storage, the cubs tracking his movement like tiny heat-seeking missiles. And texture? Soft, but with resistance. Something to bite, to practice with developing teeth. Reuben pulled out several containers, his brain already assembling a plan. He had premium protein stocks, various types kept for species that could process Earth-origin meats. Beef, chicken, fish. He had seasonings that could enhance or mask flavors. He had binding agents, texturizers, and more cooking techniques than he could count. Most importantly, he had a theory. These cubs didn't want boring nutrition slurry. They wanted interesting food. "Amrisa, I need you to trust me for about 20 minutes. Can you keep them from destroying my kitchen while I work?" The Nalrathi caretaker looked at the cubs, then at the kitchen, then back at Reuben with an expression that suggested she found both requests equally impossible. "I will attempt this." "Good enough." Reuben cleared a workspace and started pulling ingredients. The cubs watched with rapt attention, their heads swiveling to follow his every movement. He selected a lean cut of beef, high in iron, rich in protein, and began processing it. Not raw, but not cooked into oblivion either. Seared on high heat to create flavor compounds, then ground into a mixture that would be soft enough for young teeth, but substantial enough to feel satisfying. He added a touch of seasoning. Nothing fancy, just salt to enhance natural flavors and a whisper of umami from aged stock. Formed the mixture into small, bite-sized portions, nugget-shaped, easy for small mouths to handle. Nix crept closer, nostrils working overtime. The smell of cooking meat had every cub's attention now. "Not yet," Reuben told them, working quickly. He prepared a simple glaze using reduced stock and a hint of something sweet. Nalrathi biochemistry could handle certain sugars according to his mental database of species requirements. The sweetness would contrast with the iron-rich meat, creating complexity that immature taste buds might find novel. Into the oven they went, just long enough to set the glaze and bring everything to a safe temperature. While they cooked, Reuben prepared presentation. He'd learned long ago that how food looked mattered almost as much as how it tasted, regardless of species. Small plates, cub-sized portions, arranged not in boring piles but in playful patterns. He added a few edible garnishes for color, nothing the cubs had to eat, but enough to make the plates visually interesting. The timer chimed. Reuben pulled out his creation and let them cool for exactly 30 seconds. Any longer, and he'd lose the aromatic compounds that were currently making every cub in the kitchen vibrate with anticipation. He set one plate down in front of Nix. The cub stared at it, sniffed it, looked up at Reuben with those unsettling amber eyes as if asking permission. "Go ahead," Reuben said. "It won't bite back." Nix lowered his head and took a cautious bite. Chewed experimentally. Swallowed. Then proceeded to devour the entire portion in approximately 3 seconds, making sounds that Reuben really hoped were expressions of enjoyment and not some kind of distress call. The other 5 cubs immediately mobbed him, demanding their own plates. Reuben had prepared enough, barely, and distributed portions while Amrisa watched in stunned silence. All 6 cubs ate. Not just ate, demolished their food with an enthusiasm that would have been alarming if it wasn't exactly what Reuben had been hoping for. When the plates were empty, licked clean, actually, which was oddly gratifying, 6 pairs of amber eyes turned back to Reuben with identical expressions of expectation. "Oh, no," Reuben said. "Absolutely not. You are not getting me trained to feed you on demand like some kind of organic food dispenser." Nix made a sound somewhere between a chirp and a purr. "Don't you start with the cute noises. I'm immune to cute." He wasn't immune to cute. Nobody was immune to cute, especially when cute came with multiple rows of teeth and looked at you like you'd just solved world hunger. Amrisa finally found her voice. They ate. They actually ate. Turns out, even apex predators appreciate good presentation and flavor complexity. Reuben started cleaning his workspace, trying to ignore 6 small predators who had apparently decided he was now the most important person in their universe. Question is, what do we do about it? I can't cook individual meals for 6 cubs 3 times a day. I've got a station full of people to feed. Perhaps, Amrisa hesitated. Perhaps we could arrange. A loud crash from the dining area interrupted her, followed by Talian's voice, raised in what sounded like diplomatic panic. What now? Reuben headed for the kitchen door, his new entourage following so closely he nearly tripped over them. The cafeteria had filled with the afternoon crowd, and standing in the middle of it, looking like someone had just told them their ship had been impounded, was a delegation of Peluvian parents, with their younglings, who were all staring at the Nalrathi cubs with a mixture of terror and fascination. This, Reuben realized with growing dread, was about to get complicated. The Peluvian younglings were nothing like the Nalrathi cubs. Where Nix and his companions were all scales and teeth, and barely contained chaos, the Peluvian children were translucent, delicate things that seemed to shimmer in the cafeteria's lighting. They moved with the uncertain wobbling of beings still learning to navigate physical space, their photosynthetic membranes rippling with colors that Reuben's kitchen training had taught him indicated emotional states. Right now, those colors were flickering between pale yellow, curiosity, and deep orange, fear. The parent Peluvians had positioned themselves between their offspring and the Nalrathi cubs like living shields, their own membranes showing distinctly hostile red patterns. Talion stood off to one side, looking like a man watching a diplomatic incident unfold in slow motion. "Reuben," Talion said with forced calm, "perhaps we should relocate the Nalrathi younglings back to—" "Stay right there," one of the Peluvian parents cut in, their voice carrying the crystalline quality of their species. "Those creatures already terrorized the morning diners. We demand they be removed before—" Nix chose that moment to chirp, that same almost cute sound he'd made in the kitchen. Several Peluvian younglings chirped back, their voices higher-pitched, almost musical. Everyone froze. Orna tilted her head and made a different sound, something like a questioning trill. A Peluvian youngling responded with a cascade of notes that sounded like wind chimes. "Are they?" Talion started. "Communicating," Amrisa finished, her spinal ridge rising in surprise. "I have never seen younglings of different species attempt." "Food," Reuben said suddenly, the pieces clicking together in his head. "They're talking about food." Everyone looked at him. He pointed at the Nalrathi cubs, who were now creeping closer to the Peluvians, not in a predatory way, but with the cautious interest of children encountering other children. "They just ate. They're content, not hunting. And these little ones," he gestured at the Peluvian younglings, "are curious. Watch." One of the Peluvian younglings broke away from their parents' protection, wobbling forward with more bravery than sense. The parent made a sound of alarm, but the youngling ignored them, approaching Tali, the smallest Nalrathi cub, with outstretched appendages. Tali sat down, making herself even smaller, and waited. The Peluvian youngling touched one of Tali's scales with a delicate membrane-covered limb. Tali's tail swished once, gently, and she made a soft rumbling sound that might have been pleasure. "Oh, no," Reuben muttered. "Oh, this is going to be a whole thing." Within moments, the other Peluvian younglings had overcome their fear and swarmed the Nalrathi cubs, not fleeing, not fighting, playing. The cubs responded with careful enthusiasm, their movements suddenly controlled in a way Reuben hadn't seen before. They understood, somehow, that these playmates were fragile. The Peluvian parents looked ready to intervene, but their younglings were already climbing on the cubs like living jungle gyms, fascinated by the texture of scales and the movement of tails. "Well," Talion said into the stunned silence, "that's unexpected." More unexpected was what happened next. A Ruknari family entered the cafeteria, crystalline beings who resembled ambulatory geodes, with 3 of their own younglings in tow. The Ruknari hatchlings took one look at the interspecies play session and immediately joined in, apparently deciding that if the prey species Peluvians weren't afraid, neither would they be. Then came a family Reuben didn't recognize, something vaguely aquatic with tentacles and bioluminescent patterns. Their offspring added themselves to the growing chaos with cheerful disregard for species boundaries. "Amrissa," Reuben said, watching his cafeteria transform into an impromptu nursery. "What exactly do Nalrathi younglings eat besides what I just made them? I do not understand the question. How often do they need to eat? What's a normal feeding schedule?" Amrissa's attention was divided between Reuben and the younglings, clearly torn between answering and intervening in the play session. Small meals, frequently. Every few hours when they are this young. Their metabolisms are fast, right. Reuben's mind was already racing ahead. "And these other species younglings? Talion, you've got demographic data on every species on this station. What do their feeding requirements look like?" Talion pulled out his tablet, catching on, too, wherever Reuben's thoughts were going. "Peluvians need light exposure and mineral supplements every 4 to 6 hours. Ruknari hatchlings consume crushed minerals and trace metals about as frequently. Most species with younglings on station have similar high-frequency, low-volume feeding patterns." "Because growing bodies need constant fuel," Reuben said, "regardless of whether you're photosynthetic or a carnivore or somewhere in between." "What are you thinking?" Reuben watched Nix carefully play wrestle with a Peluvian youngling, while Pip showed a Ruknari hatchling how to use his tail for balance. "I'm thinking that we've been approaching this all wrong. The adults come here, eat their species-appropriate meals, and leave. But younglings, they need something different. Not just nutritionally, socially." One of the Peluvian parents had relaxed enough to approach Amrissa, speaking in low tones. Reuben caught fragments. "Never seen my offspring so engaged?" And perhaps we were too quick to judge. "They need a menu," Reuben continued, his voice taking on the particular tone it got when an idea had fully taken root. "Not just food, but an experience, something designed for them specifically." "A children's menu," Talion said slowly, "for multiple species. Not just multiple species, all the younglings on station. Nutrition tailored to their biology, but presentation and variety designed for developing minds that get bored easily." Reuben started walking back toward his kitchen, his steps quickening as the plan solidified. Small portions, interesting textures, fun presentations, things they can eat together without triggering prey-predator responses. Amrisa followed, the universal translator picking up her words. You would do this? Create meals for younglings not of your own species? I'm already feeding half the galaxy. Might as well feed the other half, too. Reuben pushed through the kitchen doors, immediately moving to his planning station. Here's what I'm thinking. We keep the meat-based items I made for your cubs, but we add variety. Different proteins, different preparations. For the Peluvians, enhanced light-reactive dishes with mineral supplements worked into crystalline garnishes they can absorb through their membranes. He started sketching on a digital pad, his hands moving with the muscle memory of decades in professional kitchens. Ruknari get mineral clusters in various densities and flavors. Yeah, minerals can have flavor profiles. It's all about trace element composition. We can make them colorful, arrange them in patterns that appeal to developing aesthetic senses. This would require significant resources, Talion pointed out, but his tone suggested he was already calculating logistics rather than objecting. This would prevent significant diplomatic incidents, Reuben countered. You've got younglings from how many species on station right now? Talion checked his tablet. 38. Different species currently have offspring in residence. 38 potential disasters waiting to happen, because nobody thought about what happens when you stick a bunch of bored, hungry kids in close quarters with nothing to do. Reuben pulled up nutritional databases, cross-referencing compatible ingredients. But if they're occupied, well-fed, and socializing positively, that's 38 species of parents who are going to be a lot more amenable to whatever negotiations brought them here. Amrisa made a sound that might have been laughter. You strategize like a warrior, but with food instead of weapons. Food is a weapon. It's also a bridge, a comfort, and a universal language. Reuben continued sketching. We'll call it the Tiny Terror menu. Tiny Terror? Talion repeated. You got a better name for a menu designed to feed small creatures of mass destruction? Reuben gestured toward the dining area, where the sounds of interspecies play had reached new volumes. Besides, parents will appreciate the honesty. A Ruknari parent poked their crystalline head through the kitchen door. Excuse the interruption, but did I hear correctly? You are creating a menu for younglings? Word traveled fast, apparently. Reuben turned to face them. Planning stages. Why? My hatchlings refuse the standard mineral blocks. Too boring, they insist. If you could create something more engaging. Get in line, Reuben said, but without heat. I've got 6 Nalrathi cubs who've apparently decided I'm their personal chef. Might as well expand the operation. More parents appeared, drawn by the conversation or possibly by the unprecedented sight of their younglings playing peacefully with natural predators. Each had similar stories: picky eaters, bored offspring, the challenges of maintaining proper nutrition in an unfamiliar environment. Reuben listened to them all, taking mental notes, his professional pride refusing to back down from the challenge. Within an hour, he had rough outlines for 24 different dishes, each tailored to specific species' needs, but designed with enough universal appeal that younglings might actually try foods outside their normal parameters. The key, he explained to the growing crowd of interested parents, is making nutrition fun. You can't force a youngling to eat any species, but you can make them want to try new things by presenting it in ways that engage their curiosity. Nix had wandered back into the kitchen, followed by his entire social group, a mixed-species parade of younglings who apparently considered Reuben's workspace the most interesting place on the station. They arranged themselves around his feet like an organic obstacle course, watching him work with varying degrees of attention. "See?" Reuben pointed at them. "They're not thinking about species differences anymore. They're just kids being kids." Food brought them together. First the Nalrathi cubs eating, then the others getting. Curious about what was happening. Now they're a unit. Talion was furiously taking notes. "The council is going to want a full proposal. Budget requirements, space allocation, staffing needs. Then they'll get it. But right now, I've got about 60 mouths to feed for dinner service. Plus," he counted the younglings at his feet, "approximately 15 small terrors who are going to be hungry again in about 2 hours." Amrisa's spinal ridge had shifted to what Reuben was learning indicated amusement. "You have created obligation for yourself." "Story of my life," Reuben muttered, but he was already pulling ingredients for the next round of experimental cooking. The cafeteria had become something new, something unplanned and chaotic and potentially wonderful. Now he just had to figure out how to make it sustainable and keep Nix from eating his kitchen. 3 weeks later, the tiny terror menu had become an institution. Reuben stood in his expanded kitchen. Talion had somehow requisitioned additional space and equipment with a speed that suggested the station administrator understood exactly how valuable this operation had become. Watching his staff prepare the afternoon service, what had started as improvised feeding for 6 Nalrathi cubs had transformed into a full-scale operation serving younglings from 42 different species. The menu itself was a work of art, if Reuben said so himself. Not that he would out loud, because that would require admitting he'd put more thought into children's food than some chefs put into their entire careers. Predator pops, protein skewers with species-appropriate glazes, arranged in colorful patterns. Chaos croquettes, mineral and protein combinations designed to appeal across dietary boundaries. Crystal clusters for the mineral consumers, light bites for photosynthesizers, and about 30 other variations that covered everything from methane breathers to creatures that absorbed nutrients through skin contact. The dining area had been reorganized. Gravity-neutral play zones allowed younglings of different physical requirements to interact safely. Adaptive seating accommodated everything from tentacles to tails, and in the center of it all, a carefully monitored feeding area where younglings could eat together, supervised by parents who had stopped seeing other species as threats and started seeing them as fellow exhausted caregivers. Reuben had discovered something about parenting. It transcended species. Didn't matter if you laid eggs or gave live birth or budded offspring from your crystalline structure, dealing with a picky eater was universal. So was the relief of finding somewhere your younglings could burn energy while you enjoyed 10 minutes of peace. The cafeteria had become a social hub, not just for younglings, but for the adults too. Reuben had overheard more productive negotiation discussions happening between parents comparing notes on developmental milestones than in any formal diplomatic session. Nix was currently demonstrating his climbing abilities to an impressed audience of Ruknari hatchlings. The little terror had grown in 3 weeks, all the cubs had, but he still showed up at Reuben's kitchen every single day, usually bringing friends. "Your shadow has arrived," Ollie announced, nodding toward the entrance where Nix had just appeared, followed by the now familiar mixed species group. "He's not my shadow. I just happen to be his favorite food source." Reuben plated a set of predator pops, arranging them with the precise care that had become his signature. Completely different relationship dynamic. "Sure, that's why you made him that special birthday portion last week." "That was a cultural obligation." Amritsar explained that recognizing growth milestones is important in Nalrathi development. Uh-huh. And the little decorative garnish shaped like his face? Reuben pointed a serving utensil at Ali. We do not talk about the garnish. The afternoon rush began in earnest. Parents arrived with younglings in tow, the noise level rising to what Reuben had learned to recognize as productive chaos rather than destructive panic. Orders came in through the updated system, species tagged, portion controlled, with accommodation requests that ranged from extra crunchy to bioluminescent presentation preferred. His expanded staff handled it with increasing efficiency. Reuben had trained them personally, passing on not just recipes but philosophy. Every youngling deserved food that made them excited to eat, regardless of whether they had teeth, beaks, filtering membranes, or absorption pores. Talion appeared during the rush, picking his way through the crowd with diplomatic precision. He waited until Reuben had a brief break between orders before speaking. The Galactic Council wants to implement this station-wide. Every diplomatic outpost, every trade hub with family accommodations. Reuben didn't look up from the protein mixture he was preparing. They want to franchise the Tiny Terror menu. They want to adapt your model, yes, tailored to local species populations, but using your core principles. My core principles being feed the kids so the parents stop panicking. Your core principles being that food sharing creates social bonds that transcend evolutionary programming, Talion corrected. You've turned this cafeteria into neutral ground. Younglings who should theoretically see each other as prey or predator or completely incompatible are playing together. Their parents are forming relationships. 3 separate trade agreements have been finalized between species who met here, comparing notes about their offspring's eating habits. Reuben finally looked up. You're saying I accidentally created a diplomatic tool using chicken nuggets and fancy mineral arrangements? I'm saying you understood something the Council missed, that the next generation doesn't care about historical conflicts if you give them reason to focus on something else, like food, and play, and making friends. A crash from the dining area made them both turn. Nix had knocked over a chair, again, but this time he was helping a Peluvian youngling right it, their combined efforts clumsy but well-intentioned. The Peluvian's parent watched with bemused tolerance instead of the horror that would have been automatic 3 weeks ago. They're still terrors, Reuben observed, just socialized terrors now. The best kind. Talion hesitated, his expression shifting to something more serious. The Nalrathi delegation is leaving tomorrow. Negotiations concluded successfully, in large part because of what happened here. Reuben felt something twist in his chest that he absolutely refused to acknowledge as emotion. Amritsar told me they're taking the cubs back home. Nix has been asking about you. According to Amritsar, he talks about the soft skin who makes good food constantly. He's a cub. He'll forget me in a week. Nalrathi don't forget, especially not pod bonds. Talion pulled something from his jacket, a long, elegant blade with a handle carved from something that gleamed like polished bone. Amritsar wanted me to give you this. It's a hunting knife, traditional Nalrathi design, given to those considered family. Reuben took the knife carefully, feeling the perfect balance, the razor edge that could probably cut through hull plating. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. She didn't have to, she insisted, said you performed the food-sharing ritual, which makes you podkin. Also said to tell you that Nix refuses to leave without saying goodbye properly. Right on cue, Nix bounded into the kitchen, ignoring every rule about younglings in food preparation areas. He sat directly in front of Reuben, tail curled around his feet, amber eyes bright and attentive. Amrisa followed, her posture apologetic, but her expression warm. He would not be denied. I apologize for the intrusion. It's fine. Reuben crouched down, putting himself at eye level with the cub who'd started this entire chaotic adventure. So, you're heading home? Nix made a sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a chirp. Something sad. Yeah, I know. But you can't stay here. You've got a whole planet to grow up on. Things to learn. Proper Nalrathi things that I definitely can't teach you. Reuben reached out slowly, letting Nix decide whether to accept the contact. The cub pressed his scaled head into Reuben's palm, purring with that small engine sound. I have told him you will cook for him when we return, Amrisa said softly. The delegation plans to visit annually, for continued diplomatic relations. Annual visits? I can work with that. Reuben stood, his knees protesting again, and moved to his prep station. Give me 5 minutes. He worked quickly, preparing one last portion of Predator Pops, Nix's favorite, with extra care. Added the garnish he'd never admit to perfecting. Plated it with the kind of attention usually reserved for heads of state. When he set it down, Nix ate slowly this time, savoring each bite instead of demolishing it instantly. The other cubs had gathered at the kitchen entrance, watching their companion's farewell meal with solemn attention. You take care of yourself, Reuben told Nix when the plate was empty, and try not to terrorize whoever feeds you at home too badly. Nix chirped once, pressed against Reuben's leg with surprising gentleness, then rejoined his companions. Amrisa bowed, a formal gesture of deep respect. You have given them more than food. You have given them the understanding that different can still be safe. That strange does not mean enemy. She paused. This is a lesson many adults never learn. After they left, Reuben stood in his kitchen, holding the ceremonial knife and absolutely not feeling emotional about a scaled terror who'd disrupted his entire operation. Talion cleared his throat. So, about the council's proposal. Tell them yes, but I want final approval on any menu items using my name, and proper training for every chef involved. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Already assumed you'd say that. I have the contracts ready. The evening rush was starting. More families, more younglings, more chaos that had somehow become comfortable. Reuben returned to his station, calling out orders to his staff with practiced efficiency. Ollie caught his eye and grinned. You know you're basically running a universal daycare now, right? I'm running a cafeteria, Reuben corrected. That happens to serve extremely demanding clientele who throw tantrums if their food isn't perfect. So, a daycare. Get back to work before I assign you permanent beverage duty. But as he worked, watching younglings of a dozen species sharing space and food, and the simple joy of being kids together, Reuben had to admit, if only to himself, that maybe this was exactly what he'd been meant to do all along. Feed the galaxy, one tiny terror at a time. And if some of those terrors happened to steal a piece of his heart in the process, well, that was just an occupational hazard he'd have to live with. The tiny terror menu was here to stay. And honestly, Reuben wouldn't have it any other way.